Conspiracy Unlimited with Richard Syrett. Pursuing the truth wherever it leads. Exposing evil and corruption and the secret machinations of powerful elites. Revealing the high strangeness beneath the surface of our supposed reality. Coming to you from his studio beneath the stairs. Here's Richard Syrett.
Welcome to your Friday. Hey, just a reminder, I'm on Coast to Coast AM tonight, sitting in for George Norrie, starting at 10 p.m. Pacific. Check coasttocoastam.com to find a radio station near you. Radio internet host and blogger Mike Williams is standing by to talk about the Paul is Dead legend. This year marks the 50th anniversary of the birth of a rock and roll legend that simply will not die. In fact, it seems to be gaining more adherents. The Paul is Dead legend is this theory that Paul McCartney was killed in a car crash in the fall of 1966. His death was then kept secret, and he was replaced by a look-alike. The Beatles then set about leaving an almost endless trail of clues in their music and on their album cover art to let those with ears to hear and eyes to see that they had perpetrated a hoax. Here to discuss for the next hour is Mike Williams. Mike is a critical thinker and the host of the popular internet radio show The Sage of Quay Radio Hour. He's also the founder of the alternative news blog, Sage of Quay Radio. Mike's radio show and blog is dedicated to awakening the masses and bringing humanity back into our natural existence of living in truth and serving creation. Mike brings his audience information on alternative news, alternative research, conspiracy, holistic healing, the esoteric, spirituality, and much more. Mike and his guests are real people with real knowledge on topics and issues you need to know about. He's also an accomplished musician, singer, and songwriter. His debut album, Leaving Dystopia, was released in February of 2013, and his follow-up, Hollow Moon, was released worldwide on Feb 27th, 2018. Mike Williams, welcome to Conspiracy Unlimited. How are you?
Thank you, Richard. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
The whole Paul is Dead conspiracy has always been fascinating to me. My late radio partner, our Gary Patterson, wrote one of the definitive books on the subject, The Walrus Was Paul. How did you become interested in the Paul is Dead theory?
Well, I was aware of the theory, Richard, going back to around the 1975 timeframe, 74 around there. And in fact, in 1976, when I was in high school, I was a junior, I had put together a lecture. A friend of mine, his older brother, was very much into the conspiracy. So my high school on Long Island was very progressive. So they allowed the students to put together lectures. So I decided I was going to put one together on the Paul is Dead conspiracy. And before we got to the lecture, I remember putting up posters around the school, and I wasn't expecting really that many people to show up. But by the time we got to Doug doing his presentation, the classroom was packed. It was standing room only. So I was well aware of the clues. It's just that, like many other people, I thought it was a marketing ploy, and I just didn't put a lot of stock in being able to replace the guy. And so I always knew about it, but I just let it go. And then in, I guess, 2016, it was the summer of 2016, when I ran across the book, The Memoirs of Billy Shears by Thomas Hugh Harriet. And I can't even tell you that I was looking for a Paul is Dead book. It just popped up as something I might be interested in, because I do collect a lot of Beatle memorabilia. And so I ordered the book, not knowing anything about it. And I read the book, and I was simply blown away by it. I won't say that I bought into everything in the book when I first read it, because there is some fantastic material in it. But what made me really think about digging further into what the book was presenting was the amount of information that was being given in the book, what was being presented. And there was something inside me that said the only way this amount of information can be put in a book is that the person behind it either had to be the person playing the character of Paul McCartney or people within his inner circle that were feeding the information to the author, Tom Hugh Harriet.
So one of the fascinating aspects to me is how this, I'll use the term legend and then we can get into the evidence, but how this grew pre-internet days. Here we have someone calling Russ Gibb, a Detroit area DJ in the late 1960s, I think the summer of 69.
Right.
And it's a rumor that started on college campuses. I think it was first published in a college newspaper. And just the fact that it went viral again before we had the internet, and that it has this rumor has persisted now for 50 years. To me, that is, never mind the evidence for or against, just from a sociological perspective. To me, that is absolutely fascinating.
It is fascinating. And what I've noticed, Richard, is it ebbs and it flows. So during the 50 years, it would pick up and then it would dip, and then it would pick up interest again and then it would dip. And I would say over the last 2 or 3 years or so, it has really picked up a head of steam.
All right. So let's delve into, first of all, let's set the table. For those not familiar, there may be a few of them out there, not too many, but there may be some not familiar with the whole PID theory. Take us back to 1966. What supposedly happens? Well,
the theory is that Paul McCartney, biological Paul McCartney, died in a car crash on September 11th, 1966. So, according to memoirs, he was leaving the studio, and he had received song assignments from Brian Epstein. And I don't believe John was there. John, I think, was in France. And Paul was a little agitated at the number of songs he had to come up with, considering when Brian said the songs had to be completed. So he was concerned about the amount of time he had to write, the number of songs he was asked to write. So he left the studio a bit agitated, and he got in his car, and he was driving back home, and it was raining, and he picked up a hitchhiker, and there was an accident, a very bad car crash. And the way the story goes is that I guess he slammed into a pole, and he was decapitated. And it took a while, a number of days, for the authorities to identify him. And that was the beginning of the conspiracy. So once it was determined, and the inner circle of the Beatles, obviously, Epstein and those that are involved way above Epstein, Tavistock and such, they had a replacement put in place. And we have been listening to that replacement for the last 50 plus years. And it was quite amazing because there were an enormous level of clues, and there still are. Billy is still dropping clues to this day. For those that have ears to listen and eyes to see, they will know that the guy that they see today is not biological Paul. And the first album that Billy played on, his first debut album with the Beatles, was Sgt. Pepper. That was his album. And when Bill took over the reins of the Beatles, the deal was, and he had to break this deal with John Lennon, because Lennon was the leader of the Beatles at the time. Bill had said the only way he was going to do this, because he would have to completely step away from his life, and he would take on a new life, impersonating Paul McCartney. He would have to undergo surgeries and fillers and latex and all this stuff. It's quite bizarre when you really take a step back as the average person to think about what he decided to go do. And Lennon agreed to acquiesce and turn the reins of the Beatles over to Bill. And Billy's job was to take the Beatles in a completely different direction, to get away from kind of the love songs, boy meets girl, girl leaves boy, that type of thing there, and march the Beatles into the psychedelic era. And that was the advent of Sgt. Pepper. So that's it in a nutshell. I mean, I know it's a real 50,000-foot overview, but car crash and then a replacement who underwent extensive surgeries to be able to pull it off.
Now, the decision to replace McCartney and to suppress news of his death was made by whom? The brain trust at EMI, the Beatles themselves? How did that play out?
This gets very, very complicated. So the average PID researcher is going to tell you that it was Epstein and maybe perhaps a bit of George Martin and so on, but it was way above that. The Beatles were a Tavistock creation and project from the very beginning, from the very onset. So Tavistock looks at the Beatles in 3 phases. Phase 1 was the Beatles with Stuart Sutcliffe and Pete Best. Phase 2 of the Beatles was the biological Paul period up through 1966. and phase 3 was Billy on. So when Paul passed away, when he died, the decisions were made by Tavistock, who were controlling this psychological operation. The Beatles were put in play to social engineer. So some very heavy hitters got together, and they had to make some choices and some decisions as to who was going to replace McCartney. And they already had people in the pipeline. Billy was in the pipeline for a long time.
And Billy Shear, of course, we're introduced to him, as you say, on Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and with a little help from my friends. I hope you'll, the opening line about the one and only Billy Shear. But who is Billy Shear? Because there was a Liverpool band that were kind of a knockoff Beatles, Billy Pepper and the Pepper Pots.
Right.
And some have suggested that the singer from Billy Pepper and the Pepper Pots was the one they recruited. Who was Billy Shear or William Campbell?
Okay, so in the book Memoirs, he says his real name is William Shepherd, but others will refer to him as William Campbell, Billy Shears. I don't get hung up on the last name, Richard, because it's the same person, regardless of whether his last name is Campbell, Shepherd, Jones, Smith, it doesn't matter. But I'm going to use Shepherd because that's the name that he tells us in the book that is his real name. So Billy was a session musician going back into the late 1950s, into the early 1960s. He was born in 1937. He's 5 years older than biological Paul. I have pegged his birth date at September 9th, 1937. Billy is very much into numerology, the occult, mysticism. So numbers are very, very important to Bill. So I just looked at patterns and I started working some things out, and I do believe his birthday is September 9th, 1937. So again, he's 5 years older than biological Paul, who was born in 1942. So Billy did play with Billy Pepper and the Pepper Pots. They were a Mercy Beat band that were trying to cash in on the Beatles' popularity. If you take a look at the old albums, you'll take a look at the song credits, you'll see his name, Bill Shepherd. Then he also played with Denny Lane and Bev Bevan in a band called the Diplomats, and he used the name Phil Ackrell at the time. So he also played the character of Phil Ackrell.
That's interesting. I didn't know that. Bill Bevan later went on to play with ELO, I believe, and of course Denny Lane with the Faces, wasn't he?
The Moody Blues.
The Moody Blues, right? Before, when they were the fabulous Moody Blues, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So you could see that from the Diplomats actually recorded enough songs to put an album together. The album never got released. To me, it's because if they had released the album, we would be able to make voice comparisons. Your voice patterns are like your fingerprints. They're very distinct to that particular individual. They're called sonograms. So my belief is they just shelved the album because they knew that if they put it out there, some intrepid person who is familiar with that type of technology would delve into it. In fact, there was a professor that did do this back in 1969, and he did voice analysis. I think it was Yesterday versus Penny Lane, and he had determined that they were two different singers. Of course, Yesterday was biological Paul, and Penny Lane was Billy. So in any case, he did play with the Diplomats, according to the Memoirs of Billy Shears. I've done a lot of analysis to map his facial features, and I have determined that indeed he did play the character of Phil Ackrell. And he then also played the character of Vivian Stanshall in the Bonzo Dog Band. He was partnered there with Neil Innes. And for those that are familiar with the Ruddles, who were a Beatles parody band, Neil was the brainchild behind the Ruddles and the primary songwriter. So Billy had a lot of stuff going on. He likes to play a lot of characters. He's a very talented guy, and he was doing Stanshall. He was doing the Bonzo Dog Band gig when he was offered the opportunity to replace biological Paul with the Beatles, and he had to undergo surgeries, and fillers were used, and a lot of latex was used. And again, folks have a hard time with this, but this is the case. This is a very, very extravagant psychological operation. It's very, very deep, and it's difficult for some people to get their heads wrapped around how deep the rabbit hole is. But this is a conspiracy that encompasses MK Ultra. It encompasses, as I mentioned, Tavistock, the deep state, It includes magic. There's a lot of elements of Aleister Crowley embedded and weaved into the Beatle myth. The more you dig into this, the deeper the hole gets.
So all the breadcrumbs, clues that were left on album covers, in song lyrics, in backward masking, was that done out of a feeling of guilt by the surviving Beatles because they wanted to somehow let their fans know, for those with ears to hear, that they had perpetrated this hoax? Was it done as a marketing ploy, a combination?
I think it was a combination, but I have a theory about the clues that I don't hear mentioned too often. So here's my theory with the clues, Richard. The standard response is that they wanted to float them out there because there was guilt involved with Paul dying and the deception and all that stuff. And I'm not saying that that didn't exist, but I believe that the reason why the clues were there was because it was an ongoing occult ritual. So those that understand the esoteric, the occult, and magic will understand that your consciousness, your thoughts are very powerful. They create your reality. And so whenever there is an occult underpinning, underbelly of something, they are looking to bring in as much consciousness and focus to their objectives, to their agenda, because by doing this, it will help to manifest the end result that the magician or the occultist is looking to do, what they're looking to end up with. So that's what I think is a bigger piece of what was going on. Again, this is a theory that I have because I have dug into this, and I've caught some flack for going down the path that says that the Beatles, number one, were always a Tavistock project. There was nothing ever organic about them, that they were a myth and heavily immersed in the occult, that biological Paul's death was a planned ritual, and that the switch was always a part of the plan, and that biological Paul may have even been in a mind control program, going back to his connection with Jane Asher and the Ashers. So we've got this very dark piece of this puzzle that a lot of people don't want to touch or talk about or even want to accept, because we have been conditioned to look at the Beatles as this very organic, clean-cut, fun entity, this band that just brought such great music. And they did. They brought great music to the table. But in order for them to get where they got, in order to do those things, there was a huge machine behind them. Huge. You know, there's another theory out there that they do this. When I say they, we're talking about those that are involved in the pyramid of power. It's what I call it, the Illuminati, Freemasonry. It's called revelation of the method. It's part of their process to reveal their methodology, but they have to do it in a very discreet way. It's masked. It's layered. And that's why they would put the clues out there. And then when they were questioned about them, like at the end of Strawberry Fields Forever, John was asked many times, why did you say, I buried Paul? Which it's very clear that's what he says. And John will turn around and say, oh, that's not what I said. I said cranberry sauce. What they are doing is they're presenting the information so those that possess the key to knowledge will pick up on it, and they will see, they will pierce the veil and see what's really going on. And for those that don't want to pierce the veil and look beyond it, look on the other side of the curtain, they can just enjoy the show. But there's a very, very deep, involved aspect of the Beatles that more and more people now are looking into.
Some have suggested that their music, you mentioned the Tavistock Institute, and others have also included the Frankfurt Institute in there, and a gentleman by the name of Theodore Adorno,
yes,
who they claim actually, who's a fierce, sort of fierce critic of popular culture, went on record as saying that he actually hated the Beatles and pop culture, but some point to him and say he actually wrote their music. He was responsible for those compositions. What are your thoughts on the Adorno theory?
Yeah, well, there's no hard proof that Theodore Adorno wrote the music, but here's the issue. The Beatles wrote 237 original songs from 1963 through 1969. It's 305 if you count the cover songs. They did a lot of covers in the very early days. Writing 237 original songs from 63 to 69 is deemed highly improbable by many professional songwriters. So that means that they wrote an average of 40 original songs a year. And when I say they, we're talking about Lennon and McCartney, with some minor assistance here and there from George Harrison, virtually nothing from Ringo. But here's the other piece of it. to write 40 original songs that are good enough and ready to be recorded, you have to write many more songs than the 40 per year, because I'm a songwriter myself, Richard. So you'll start songs and they don't go anywhere. So you might write 4 or 5 songs or try to write 4 or 5 songs, and out of that you might get one that's deemed worthy to be recorded. And also, many people have looked at the Beatles' lyrics, taking into consideration their age. Here are guys that are in their early to mid-20s, and the lyrics appear to be beyond the life experience of 20-year-olds. So where I've landed with this is that it is very possible that uncredited hired guns were used. It's possible that even George Martin was involved in helping to craft song structure and appeal. As I mentioned in a previous presentation that I did on this, where I talked about Theodore Adorno, the verdict for me is still out, although I'm in that category that says it's highly improbable that they wrote all of those songs between Lennon and McCartney. I do believe that they did get help. There were hired guns, and that was part of the machinery, the apparatus behind them.
You mentioned the Beatles sort of as an occult ritual, and there, lo and behold, on the cover of Sgt. Pepper's is Aleister Crowley up in the, I think that's up in the upper left-hand corner.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the album cover, because that's often depicted as a funeral. And we have, of course, the funeral wreaths and so forth. The bass, Paul's instrument, looks very much like a funeral wreath. Let's walk through some of the clues on Sgt. Pepper's. You start wherever you'd like.
Well, I don't have the album cover in front of me right now, but basically Sgt. Pepper is a funeral scene. You've got Billy standing right behind the bass drum. If you take a mirror and you place it halfway down that bass drum, it will say "He died," and it's going to give a date, and the date it gives is September 11th. Now, those in the UK will say that the date is November 9th, but in the Memoirs of Billy Shears, Bill tells us that they use the American construct of date, September 11th. So for those that are not familiar and you have the Sgt. Pepper album, it's best to do it with the album cover from vinyl, because the CD is going to be very small. But take a mirror and put it halfway up the bass drum, and you're going to see "He died."
Where it says lonely, in other words, where it says "Lonely Hearts," if you split that in two with the edge of a mirror,
yeah,
what you're going to say is "He dies," and then it'll give the date.
Yeah, it's the date first, and then it's going to say "He died," and it's going to show an arrow or a diamond pointing right up at McCartney, the character McCartney being played by Bill. And also, if you flip the album cover over, you look at the back, you're going to see that Billy, his back is facing us. And the reason why Billy's back is facing us is because that's symbolic of him being the new leader of the band. He is the conductor. There are many, many clues. When they did the album cover, again, this is coming out of Memoirs. There's an entire chapter titled Masonic Checkmate. And Bill tells us virtually everything that is in that album cover, all Masonic clues. Where everybody is looking, Richard, if you start to take rulers and you start drawing straight lines and all this, it's all geometric. I know this sounds absolutely crazy, but this is the amount of work and effort that went behind putting this together. Billy is a very high-level Freemason. Today, I am convinced that he is above the 33rd degree, and he is in what I refer to as the illuminated degrees. So Billy was not just some schlep they pulled off the streets. Billy has blue blood. His lineage goes back to William Wallace. Mel Gibson played the character in Braveheart. He is formally trained in music. He's highly skilled. He can read, write, and score music. We have always been told that none of the Beatles can read music. Well, none of the original 4 Beatles or the Phase 2 Beatles, John, George, Ringo, and Paul, could read music, but Billy can. This is why we have Billy conducting orchestras and writing scores. There's an album out that he did an orchestra arrangement of his album Ram. It's called Percy Thrillington. That's Bill who did all that. He scored the entire thing for an orchestra, and he oversaw the entire project. I'm sure he even conducted it, if not played on it.
It's fascinating because, again, our Gary Patterson always used to joke that if this was true, somehow they managed to find a left-handed bass player more talented than the original? Because I think you could make that argument, although, the biological Paul, as you call him, composed yesterday. But if we look at the body of work after 1966, one could argue that the faux Paul is more talented than the original. What are your thoughts there?
Well, a lot of people will make that argument. So here's where I stand on this. A lot of people like to beat up on Bill and say he's not as talented as Paul and all this. I don't subscribe to that one bit. We had biological Paul McCartney in the equation for 2.5 years. So I'm going from 1963 through September of 1966, right? 2.5 to 3 years. For the last 50 plus years, the person that has been writing the music as Paul McCartney is Bill. And he's a very, very talented guy. Now, he is right-handed naturally. He's a natural right-handed guitar player. He had to teach himself how to play left-handed. And in the book, he states that when he records, he still plays right-handed. But think about the skill and determination it had to take for a right-handed guitar player to become very adept at playing left-handed. Paul McCartney was a very good bass player, but I think that Bill, when he's playing right-handed, is probably just as good as biological Paul. Left-handed, I've noticed that, especially during the period after 1966, well, I should probably say this. During the Wings years when he was playing live, I noticed that the bass lines were a little more simplified when he was playing live. Recording, they sounded okay because he was playing right-handed in the studio. And it was okay for him to play right-handed in the studio because the people who were in the studio with him all knew he wasn't biological Paul, so it was fair game. But I did notice a degradation in the bass playing as he went into Wings and went live. But when I say degradation, Richard, and for the listening audience, I'm not demeaning him in any way. His bass playing was still very, very good.
I mean, when I listen to McCartney now, I think one of the most melodic bass players out there. I think he plays it almost like a lead instrument.
Yes, yes. Oh, he has said that. People ask him about his bass playing style, and he says, I basically play the bass the same way I would play a guitar. That's what he tells us. So you're right on the money.
Let's get back to Sgt. Pepper.
Yep.
On the back album, and I miss vinyl because I miss the liner notes. I miss the lyrics and so forth. But there is a song, the lyrics on the back, She's Leaving Home. I believe, I don't have it in front of me either, but I believe George Harrison is sort of pointing down to a particular line in that song, She's Leaving Home. Can you talk to me about that?
Yeah, so he's pointing to a line. I think it says that.
Yeah, it is Wednesday, 5 a.m. or something. 5
a.m. Right. So he's actually pointing to the time when biological Paul and the person in the car, who in the book we're told her first name was Donna, actually died. So what happened was they didn't actually pronounce biological Paul dead on September 11th, although he died September 11th. The reason why they couldn't declare it is because they couldn't identify his body. So I think what George is doing there, he's kind of given us a clue as to the time frame in which Paul was declared officially dead. Also, if you look at the front of the album, this is one that a lot of people don't talk about and they miss. The Beatles are holding instruments in their hands, and it's very interesting because they're holding wind instruments. So you have John Lennon holding a French horn, you have Ringo Starr holding a trumpet, the McCartney character, that's Bill, he's holding an English horn, and we have George Harrison holding a piccolo. All of those instruments are instruments that Bill plays. Bill, by trade, is a wind instrument player. He's also a piano player, and of course he could play guitar and bass. So each of the Beatles is holding one of Bill's instruments. And this was another clue that was put out there that many people did not pick up on.
Strawberry Fields Forever.
Yep.
Some backward masking. What do they say?
In Strawberry Fields at the end, John says, I buried Paul.
Now, is that backward masking or is that just heard on one channel?
Yeah, no, that's not backmasking at the end of Strawberry Fields when John says, I buried Paul. As I mentioned earlier, when he was asked about that line, he insisted that what he was saying was cranberry sauce. But if you listen it's not hard to hear I Buried Paul. Although people will say that on the anthology DVD, on the anthology album, there is a version in which he does say cranberry sauce, but that is not the version that wound up on the Magical Mystery Tour album.
Of course, everyone points to the song A Day in the Life, and the lyrics there just sort of screaming out that Paul was killed in a crash. He blew his mind out in a car. But there's other lyrical clues there as well. Can you talk to me about A Day in the Life?
Well, A Day in the Life, it talks about, I read the news today, oh boy. They're talking about Paul. All of the Beatles songs, Richard, have some level of Paul is dead clues in them since Sgt. Pepper. What the Beatles did was they layered songs. So layering meant that it would appear to mean one thing to a listener, but it meant something else to them or to people that were in the know or people who were really astute. They also used to switch he with she. So they might sing about a woman or a girl, but they were really talking about a he. And many times they were talking about biological Paul, or they were talking about Billy stepping in and playing the part of biological Paul. As an example, the song, It's Getting Better. It's getting better all the time. And then John says it can't get much worse. Well, they're talking about Billy playing with the band. It's getting better all the time. And it was a rough ride in the beginning, getting this whole thing underway. And then John sarcastically sings, it can't get much worse. So when we're listening to this, we don't put much together. We just think it's John having a very clever, witty moment with the lyrics. But in reality, what he's doing is it's a banter between him and Bill.
Is this ultimately why the Beatles gave up touring? Because they were afraid that people in their last concert in 1966 at Shea Stadium, they were afraid that people would spot the imposter.
Brian Epstein was told that there's no more live performances, and the reason why they did that was because the probability that people would pick up on the difference would have been fairly high because Bill is taller than biological Paul. Billy stands around 6'2". It's interesting. I received an email just the other day. I get a lot of emails, Richard, from people who are really looking into this and people who are in the music industry. So this particular person was a guitarist for a very, very famous artist. And I won't say who it is because I do not want to give this person's identity away. But he was with this very famous artist in the 1970s. So he wrote me the other day and he said, Mike, I walked into a recording studio and he said, and I walked into this one room, and when I walked in there, George Harrison was there. And I was in, he said, he was talking about himself. He was in the wrong room. And he said he was only about 5 feet from George. And he realized, oops, wrong studio. But while he was there, he took in George's height relative to his own. And then he said, many years later, he ran into Billy in New York City. And he said hello to him. I guess they were crossing the street or whatever. And Bill was there with Linda. And he said, Mike, he's a tall guy. He's tall. He's much taller than George was. So that's an example of the height discrepancy. So, and again, this is coming from somebody who was in the music industry that met George. I mean, didn't know him, but, ran into him, and then also ran into Bill and was easily able to detect the height difference. Whereas when you look at the old footage of the Beatles, you'll take a look and you'll see that all of the Beatles are approximately the same size, but, except for Ringo. Ringo was a little shorter. But if you look at George, John, and Paul, they're within an inch of each other.
And what was biological Paul's height?
That's something that bounces around a lot, Richard, and I'm convinced it's intentional. So if I go back to one of my old albums, it says that Paul is 5'11". Biological Paul was 5'11". Then we get other reports that he was maybe 5'9", around there. And we have Billy, who stands at over 6 foot, 6'2". So I want to say that in my research, I have found Paul to be anywhere between 5'9" and 5'11". But like I said, and Bill is much taller than that. So he's got 3 or 4 inches on him.
Are there photos of biological Paul with Jane Asher and Billy Shear with Jane Asher?
Yep. That's the other thing, right? So we have Paul and Jane Asher together, and you'll see that they're about the same height. So which says Paul wasn't a very tall guy. It probably calls into question whether he was even, 5'9". But in any case, he's about the same height as Jane Asher, maybe a little taller. And then we have pictures where when Billy came in, he was with Jane Asher for a period of time, and this was just to keep up the front. He didn't have a relationship with Jane. He was just keeping up the front. And you can easily see that he towers over Jane Asher. I mean, he's got her by about 5 or 6 inches. So, those pictures are out there, and it's very easy to see that there are height differences.
Just quickly run through. I mean, there are so many clues, but just give us 2 or 3 more that you think just really knock this theory out of the park.
Well, all the backmasking. In the song "I'm Only Sleeping," John sings at the end. There's some gibberish there, and you just think it's gibberish when you listen to the song full. When you play it backwards, he's saying, "Paul is dead, miss him, miss him, miss him." If you play "Let It Be" backwards, you're going to clearly hear Bill singing, "Paul is dead, he's dead, he's dead, he's dead." So this type of backmasking is in many, many of the songs. As an example, it even goes back to the Beatles album "Yesterday and Today." Let me just say this, Richard, because I have to say this in order for this to make sense. I believe that Paul McCartney, he had to deal with unseen forces. In my presentation back in December of 2018, I talked about the Crossroads and Robert Johnson.
Right.
But also, I played a clip of Bob Dylan talking to Ed Bradley on 60 Minutes. And Bob spills the beans and talks about making a deal with the chief commander. And what was that deal about? That deal was about changing destiny. I believe that Paul McCartney was in a program. I believe he was in some kind of mind control program. The Ashers, Jane Asher's father, was in the business of psychiatry. He was connected into I'm trying to remember the guy's name. Stephen Ward. I'm sorry. I apologize for that, folks. But Stephen Ward was a central figure in the 1963 Profumo affair, which was a British political scandal. It was a sex scandal, big time.
Yeah, the defense minister.
Right. Ward also had ties to Dr. Richard Asher. And it is alleged by other researchers that he supplied patients to Asher for sexual and psychological experiments. And he was also suspected of being a monarch mind control person. It's also been tied together by other researchers that Brian Epstein knew Ward and that he actually was hawking the Beatles to Ward. And people would ask, well, why would he do that? It was because Stephen Ward had a very high-powered clientele. He was highly networked with organized orgies, sex trafficking, and he was a Freemason. So this thing starts to get really, really murky, right? So we have Margaret Asher, who was Jane Asher's mother. She was a music teacher, and she taught Beatle producer George Martin. So she was George Martin's music teacher. It gets to be, like I said, very, very interesting when you start to bring in all these players. So I have a quote here from Stephen Ward, and it's good for me to read this quote because this will give you an idea from his mouth what it is that he was into. "It would be humbug if I did not confess that I looked forward to sex orgies. I have been to every type of that party, those specializing in certain perversions and those given in an elaborate setting where all the formalities were observed. Many of the people who attended are rich and famous. Many faces that are seen in public life and on television, if their public could only see them like this." So this is the person, this is the stuff that he was involved in. Like I said, researchers have tied him to Richard Asher. We know that Richard Asher was involved in psychiatry. Richard Asher was found dead in his basement. They chalked it up to suicide, but I think he was in his basement for a week and nobody found him, which seems a little odd, right?
Brian Epstein, another suicide.
Brian Epstein, right. So Brian Epstein, they say is suicide, but in all likelihood, Brian Epstein was taken out because Brian Epstein had a lot of problems with drugs. He had a lot of problems with booze, and he liked the young lads. And, not his sexual preference being an issue, but what I'm saying is you bring it all together in the circles he was running in with drug and alcohol issues. I believe what happened was the powers that were controlling this whole thing were thinking, he's a loose cannon, loose lips sink ships, we need to take him out. So And all of these things, as you know, Richard, they always wind up being suicide. It's like Jimi Hendrix. They said Hendrix was a suicide. Jimi Hendrix was, in all likelihood, waterboarded. They found wine in his lungs.
Yes.
Right? So, anyway.
You mentioned, I just wanted to backtrack for a moment because you mentioned the album Yesterday and Today.
Yeah.
And, of course, the questionable album cover with the dismembered baby parts all over them, that was quickly pulled. But there is on the back, I believe, of the album, Paul McCartney's in a steamer trunk. And some say, well, that was proof, that he was already underground. But that album came out like in the summer of '66. So that predates the Paul is Dead. Was that kind of predictive programming, or what was going on there?
Yeah. So there's two things going on there. So we'll stick with the Yesterday and Today album. The first album cover that came out was the Butcher album. That's the one you're talking about with the baby parts. So that just reeks of Mind Control and MK Ultra, Monarch Mind Control, the breaking up of the body, the pieces. And then they replaced that because they said, whoops, okay, sorry, we didn't realize it would offend so many people, which was ridiculous. They knew that it would offend. What they're doing is that they're putting it out there. Again, it's, in my view, this is focusing people's attention and consciousness on something like that. In the minds of the occultist and the magician, this is how power is brought about in order to manifest and bring about their objectives. Then they replaced it with a paste over it. That was the trunk cover. And we've got biological Paul sitting in a trunk cover, and we have the rest of the Beatles, all of the Beatles, in fact, looking very solemn. It was predictive programming. Because if we go back to what I was saying before, we go back to the Crossroads. If McCartney had some kind of deal with unseen forces, the way this works with the Crossroads, and I know there's going to be people that are just going to think this is total malarkey, but just hear me out. What happens when you go to the Crossroads is your destiny is changed. So you don't live the life that you actually came to live. It gets altered. The script gets rewritten. So the unseen forces, or the unseen force, the chief commander is what Dylan calls them, they will rewrite the script for you. But there's a cost. There's a consequence for it. And in many cases, there's some kind of sacrifice. It's either the life of the person who reached the agreement, shook on it, their life will end early. We can think about the 27 Club as an example, all the people in the 27 Club. Right. Or we can think in terms of they themselves might live a long life, but something tragic happens in their family. As an example, and I'm just using this as an example. I'm not saying that Eric Clapton went to the Crossroads, although he sang the song, the Eric Johnson song, The Crossroads, right?
So too did the Allman Brothers.
Yes.
So too did Leonard Skinner, although Skinner never recorded it, but apparently it was kind of a warm-up tune. So we know the the legacy there.
The legacy of
that song.
Right. We know, and with Clapton, we know he lost his child.
Yes.
So if you follow this thread, what it says is that from very early on, the Beatles were earmarked to be what they became. And there was different phases that they went through. So in the first phase, as I mentioned before, we had Stuart Sutcliffe. And what happened to Sutcliffe? He died at an early age. Then we had phase 2. We had Paul McCartney. He would have been granted fame and fortune and wealth, but the agreement would have been, but your life's going to be very different. What does that mean? I don't think, Richard, that it is explained specifically and detailed out what's going to happen. You only know that something's going to happen and something is going to be cut short. It could be your own life. It could be the life of a loved one or whatever. You have to live with that. And the thing is, you just don't know when the hammer is going to fall. So Paul knew that he made this deal. And because Paul knew he made this deal, the clues started to come out. He started writing songs like Yesterday, which we are told came to him in a dream. Okay, came to him in the dream. The entire song came to him in a dream. All right, well, perhaps that was some kind of mind control initiation, some kind of mind control plant that song lyrics are put into his head. And he's thinking, it came to me in a dream. We have Eleanor Rigby. And Eleanor Rigby talks about death. Yesterday, like we mentioned, I'm not half the man I used to be. We have the trunk cover. If you take a look at the songs on Yesterday and Today, if you look at the sequence of songs, it's actually telling us a story. It's talking about Drive My Car. It has Yesterday. It has Act Naturally, which would be a a message to Billy, just act naturally, Billy. I would ask the folks, I don't have the album in front of me, too bad. If I had known we were going to talk about this, I would have pulled the albums, but take a look at the song sequence and see that it makes sense. So, in my view, and I'm one of probably the few researchers out there investigating this, Richard, who will say that this whole thing with McCartney was a planned ritual from the very beginning, and that the switch was always part of the plan. It's occulted. It reeks of mysticism, of magic, and it's Freemasonry up and down. Again, like I said, it's not a bright, fuzzy story to tell, but this is the conclusion I've come to.
Mike, you've laid out the evidence brilliantly. You've made your case. How do people find you online and your YouTube channel?
All they need to do, Richard, is go to my hub website. It's Sage of Quay, SageofQuay, sageofquay.com. If you go to that one website, everything is there. YouTube, my blog, all that stuff.
Mike, I've really enjoyed hanging out with you for the last hour. Let's do this again sometime. I'm sure there's a part 2 and a part 3.
Thank you, Richard.
Okay, before I dim the lights in my little studio beneath the stairs, I'm going to tell you what's coming up next on Conspiracy Unlimited. If you're a fan of this podcast or my weekly syndicated radio program, The Conspiracy Show, why not consider becoming a supporter? Go to patreon.com/Strange Planet. That's right, we've changed the name of our Patreon page. Patreon.com/Strange Planet. And check out our 3 support tiers: the Truth Seeker tier, the Whistleblower tier, and the Star Chamber tier. Donors can receive access to an exclusive monthly Google Hangout on air or a monthly live chat with me. You can also be eligible for a monthly draw and a chance to win Conspiracy Show and Conspiracy Unlimited merch. Patreon.com/Strange Planet. Patreon.com/Strange Planet. Your support is greatly appreciated. Join me Monday as my guest, author Lori Bonner Nicholas, discusses evidence that Chinese explorers beat Christopher Columbus to North America by almost 3/4 of a century. Until then, I'm Richard Syrett. So long for now.
A new Conspiracy Unlimited with Richard Syrett drops every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at conspiracyunlimitedpodcast.com. Blow your mind. That is all for now. Oh, and remember to share and give a 5-star review because we have huge egos and need love. We're like cats. We need constant petting.
I was walking down this dusty road.